Look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, sir, but this isn't the county fair plinking contest. The liability insurance alone is staggering. That rifle, it doesn't even have optics. The man speaking was named Sterling, a man whose crisp corporate logo polo shirt was a stark contrast to the swirling dust of the Nevada high desert. He ran the Viper Strike Long Range Challenge, an event that drew shooters with rigs that cost more than a mid-size sedan. He gestured vaguely toward the rifle in question, a long wooden thing in a worn canvas case, as if it were a contagious disease. The man holding it just stood there, his presence as quiet and weathered as the ancient juniper trees dotting the landscape. He was old, with a face mapped by sun and time, and hands that looked like they'd spent a lifetime wrestling with the earth. His flannel shirt was faded, his jeans patched, and his boots were scuffed into a soft brown suede. He didn't look like a competitor. He looked like he'd taken a wrong turn on his way to the feed store. "I've got the entry fee," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly hum, like stones rolling in a slow river. He didn't seem offended or deterred. He just stated it as a fact. From a short distance away, leaning against the fender of his truck, former Marine Sergeant Marco Reyes watched the exchange. Reyes wasn't competing. He came to these events to stay connected to the world of precision shooting, a world that had defined him for 8 years. It was a hobby now, a way to keep the skills from rusting completely. He saw the scene unfold and felt a familiar, weary sigh build in his chest. He'd seen this a dozen times. Some old-timer shows up with a deer rifle, thinking his hunting skills will translate to a world of ballistic coefficients, spin drift, and milliradian adjustments. It usually ended with quiet embarrassment and a few wasted, expensive rounds of ammunition. Sterling was trying to be polite, his voice oozing a kind of forced professional patience. "Sir, the target is a 24-inch plate, and it's swinging at 1,200 yards. The wind out here today is gusting to 20 miles per hour. Our top shooters, men with custom-built rifles, $1,000 scopes, and ballistic computers, are struggling. I just want to manage expectations." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes not on Sterling, but looking far downrange, past the shimmering waves of heat rising from the desert floor. It was an unnerving gaze, one that seemed to be measuring something Sterling couldn't see. "I understand the problem," he said. The problem, as Reyes saw it, was the rifle. What he could see of it peeking from the case was dark walnut and blued steel. There was no Picatinny rail, no carbon fiber stock, no oversized tactical bolt knob. It was an antique, a relic. Standing nearby was Caleb Vance, the current golden boy of the long-range scene. Sponsored by a high-end optics company, Caleb was all swagger and technical jargon. He smirked at his companions, a small cadre of equally gear-obsessed shooters. "Somebody's grandpa is lost," Caleb said, just loud enough to be heard. "Probably thinks he's signing up for the turkey shoot." The old man gave no sign he'd heard. He just pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and carefully counted out the $300 entry fee in wrinkled 20s and a 10. He pushed the money across the folding table towards Sterling. Sterling looked at the cash, then at the old man's unyielding, placid face, and finally sighed in resignation. He knew he couldn't refuse the entry without cause. He took the money. "Name?" he asked, his pen hovering over the registration form. "Silas," the old man said. "Just Silas." Sterling scribbled it down. "All right, Silas, you're number 47, firing line E. Good luck. You're going to need it." Silas simply nodded, took his registration card, and turned to walk toward the designated area. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that caught Reyes's eye. It wasn't the shuffling gait of an old man whose joints ached. It was something else. It was measured, controlled. Each step seemed placed with purpose, his back ramrod straight, his head on a swivel, not in a nervous way, but in a constantly aware state. Reyes pushed himself off his truck. The weary sigh he'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: intense, professional curiosity. Reyes decided to follow, keeping a respectful distance. He told himself he was just going to watch the inevitable, humbling failure. A small piece of desert theater. But he knew it was more than that. Something about Silas had snagged a thread in the part of his brain that had been trained to see things others missed. It was the little details, the tells that screamed a different story than the flannel shirt and faded jeans. As Silas found his designated spot on the firing line, he didn't immediately uncase his rifle. Instead, he just stood there, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, in a posture that on anyone else would look casual, but on him looked like a parade rest that had been softened by 50 years. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the entire range. He wasn't looking at the other shooters or their futuristic equipment. He was looking at the windsocks, yes, but also at the distant sway of sagebrush on the far berm, the direction the dust kicked up from the tires of a range vehicle a half-mile away, the subtle dance of the heat mirage rising from the ground. Reyes had spent hundreds of hours in sniper school learning to do exactly that, to read the invisible rivers of air, not with an instrument, but with his eyes. It was a dying art in the age of handheld weather stations. He watched Silas's hands as the old man finally reached down for his rifle case. They were gnarled and thick with calluses, the knuckles scarred. They were a farmer's hands, no doubt. But there was a steadiness to them, a complete lack of the tremor that often comes with age. As he unbuckled the leather straps, his movements were fluid and certain. He wasn't fumbling. He was performing a well-rehearsed ritual. The rifle that emerged from the case was even more of an antique than Reyes had imagined. It was a Winchester Model 70, the kind they called the rifleman's rifle. But this one was old. Pre-1964, Reyes guessed, from the controlled feed claw extractor. The walnut stock was dark with age and linseed oil, the fine checkering worn smooth in the places a hand would grip it. The blued finish on the barrel and receiver was faded to a soft pewter gray. And as Sterling had noted with such alarm, there was no scope, just a simple steel blade front sight and a small, precise aperture sight mounted on the receiver at the rear. Open sights, iron sights, against a moving target at over half a mile. It was patently absurd. Caleb and his friends had now wandered over, their curiosity getting the better of their condescension. They stood a few yards behind Silas, snickering quietly. "Is that a .30-06? One of them whispered. "My great-granddad used to hunt with one of those." "He's gonna be aiming at the moon to get the bullet there," Caleb said with a laugh, holding up his Kestrel wind meter. "My device says the wind value at the target is a full 9 mils. He doesn't even know what that means." Silas seemed oblivious to them. He pulled a small, worn canvas roll from his bag and laid it on the ground. It wasn't a modern shooting mat, just a piece of waxed canvas. He then produced a box of ammunition. They weren't factory-produced rounds in a plastic tray. They were loose, sitting in a cardboard box cushioned with cotton. Reyes could see that the brass was polished, the bullets seated with painstaking uniformity. They were hand loads. The work of a man who treated every single round as a sacred object. Silas lay down on the canvas, his body settling into the earth. And that's when Reyes saw it, the position. It wasn't the modern squared-off prone position taught today. It was the classic angled, high-power shooting position, a technique designed for iron sights and leather slings, a position that maximized bone support and minimized muscle tension. It was a position Reyes had only ever seen in old black-and-white photos in the back of Marine Corps marksmanship manuals. Photos of men at places like Belleau Wood and Guadalcanal. The spark of curiosity in Reyes's mind ignited into a small flame. This man wasn't a lost farmer. He was a historian, or something more. He was a living fossil from an era of shooting that Reyes had only ever read about. An era before lasers and computers, when a man's life depended on nothing more than his eye, his breath, and his trigger finger. The competition was a symphony of controlled violence and high-tech frustration. The air cracked and boomed with the reports of powerful Magnum cartridges, 338 Lapua, 300 Norma, 6.5 Creedmoor. Each shot was a complex equation. The shooters, lying prone behind their enormous rifles, would consult their ballistic apps, get a wind reading from their kestrels, dial the adjustments into their massive telescopic sights, and then wait for their spotter to give them the go-ahead. "Shooter ready," a voice would call. "Spotter ready. Wind is holding 2 mils left, gusting to 2.5. Send it." A deafening muzzle blast would follow, kicking up a cloud of dust. Then the agonizing wait of more than a second and a half as the bullet crossed the vast expanse. More often than not, the call from the spotter was a deflating, "Miss. Impact seen low and right. Adjust for wind." The wind was the great equalizer. It snaked through the shallow canyons of the range, a fickle and invisible enemy. It would gust from the left, then suddenly die, then switch to a quartering headwind, all in the space of a few seconds. The swinging plate only made the problem exponentially harder. It presented its full face for only a brief moment before swinging back to a thin-edge profile. The shot had to be timed perfectly to arrive when the plate was at its most exposed. Caleb Vance was up. He was the picture of the modern technological marksman. His rifle was a marvel of engineering, a skeletonized chassis of aluminum and carbon fiber. His scope was the size of a small telescope. He went through his pre-shot routine with theatrical precision, his fingers dancing over his wind meter and his smartphone. He dialed in his solution, took a deep breath, and fired. The bullet kicked up dust just inches off the right edge of the plate. A near miss, but a miss nonetheless. Caleb cursed under his breath, his face tightening with anger. He'd been so sure. His technology had told him exactly where to aim. The technology had been wrong. Or rather, it had been right for the single moment in time he had measured. A moment that was already gone by the time his bullet arrived. Throughout all this, Silas just lay on his canvas mat, his rifle resting on a simple sandbag, not one of the expensive bipods everyone else used. He hadn't even shouldered the weapon. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow and deep. He looked like he was napping. Reyes moved closer, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. He crouched down a respectful distance from the old man. "Wicked wind today," Reyes said, his voice quiet. Silas opened his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, but they were incredibly clear and focused. He didn't seem startled. "Wind's honest," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble. "Tells you everything, if you know how to listen." "What's it telling you now?" Reyes asked, genuinely curious. Silas shifted his gaze downrange. "It's running in cycles. A strong gust from 10 o'clock for about 10 seconds, then it drops and switches to 7 o'clock for 5, then a lull for maybe 2 or 3 seconds before it starts all over again. The trick isn't fighting it, it's waiting for the lull. But the mirage is running right to left, steady. That's the baseline. The gusts are just noise on top of it." Reyes was stunned. What Silas had just described was an incredibly sophisticated wind reading, one that accounted for cycles, lulls, and the difference between ground-level wind, the gusts, and the prevailing wind further downrange, indicated by the mirage. He hadn't used a single piece of equipment. He was reading the air itself. "You're watching the boil," Reyes said, the term slipping out unconsciously. It was old sniper slang for the shimmering distortion of heat waves, a term his own instructors had used, but which had fallen out of fashion. Silas's head turned, and he looked at Reyes, truly looked at him for the first time. A flicker of something, recognition, surprise, passed through his pale blue eyes. "Haven't heard that word in a long time," Silas said. "Who taught you to shoot, son?" "1st Marine Division, Scout Sniper School," Reyes answered, his voice now filled with a dawning respect. "Staff Sergeant Gunther." Silas gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Gunny Gunther. Knew his father. Good man. Taught him how to read the wind at Paris Island back in '68. Small world. The flame of curiosity in Reyes's chest roared into a bonfire. This wasn't just some old-timer. This man was a piece of living history. He was a link in a chain, a keeper of an ancient craft that had been passed down from one generation of marksmen to the next. He was from an era where the man was the weapon system, and the rifle was just the tool. The world of carbon fiber and ballistic computers suddenly felt flimsy and cheap, like a child's toy. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the range, the mood grew somber. The swinging plate at 1,200 yards remained untouched. One by one, the shooters packed up their expensive gear, their faces a mixture of frustration and resignation. The $15,000 prize seemed safe for another year. Sterling was at the microphone, his voice tinny through the loudspeakers. "Well, folks, it looks like the Nevada Wind has won the day. We'll be rolling the prize money over to next year's competition. Thanks to everyone for coming out." He was interrupted by one of his staff whispering in his ear. Sterling looked down at his clipboard, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Ah," he said into the mic, "it appears we have one shooter left. Number 47, Silas." A murmur went through the remaining handful of spectators. Most had forgotten about the old man with the ancient rifle. Caleb, who was packing his gear with angry, jerky movements, stopped and turned. A cruel, disbelieving smile spread across his face. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," he said to his friend. "This is going to be pathetic, or hilarious, maybe both." Silas didn't seem to hear the announcement or the murmurs from the crowd. He was already in motion, his movements unhurried and serene. He pushed a single gleaming cartridge into the chamber of the old Winchester and closed the bolt. The metallic snick was quiet, but sounded as solid and final as a bank vault door closing. He settled into his position, the rifle's worn stock finding a home against his shoulder. He took a simple leather sling and wrapped it around his left arm, cinching it tight. Not as a way to carry the rifle, but as a tool to lock his arm, the rifle, and his body into a single, stable unit. It was another piece of forgotten marksmanship lore, a technique that turned the human body into a shooting platform as steady as any bipod. Sterling walked over, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He knelt beside Silas, his voice low and conspiratorial, like he was trying to save the old man from himself. "Sir, Silas, there is absolutely no shame in calling it a day. No one has even come close. This wind is impossible. Let's not end the day on a sour note." Silas didn't turn his head. His eyes were fixed downrange, focused on that tiny, distant speck of steel. "Every day you wake up is a good day," he said, his voice calm and even. "There are no sour notes." He placed his finger gently on the trigger. The crowd, what was left of it, grew quiet. The scene was surreal. The last rays of the sun painted the mountains in hues of orange and purple. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound, and in the middle of it all was this man, a ghost from another time, with a piece of wood and steel, preparing to attempt the impossible. Caleb stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of arrogant certainty. He was waiting for the miss. He was ready to laugh, to have his worldview confirm that new was always better, that technology always trumped tradition. He believed he was about to witness a fool making a fool of himself. Reyes, however, stood perfectly still, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't watching a fool. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was about to witness a master at his work. Silas did not fire. For a long, silent minute, he simply lay there, the rifle seemingly an extension of his body. He was part of the landscape now, as still and patient as the rocks around him. The wind whipped his thin, white hair and tugged at his flannel shirt, but he didn't move a muscle. His breathing was the only perceptible motion, a slow, rhythmic cadence that Reyes recognized instantly. The diaphragmatic breathing of a trained marksman. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold the empty for 4. It slowed the heart rate, calmed the nervous system, and created a window of perfect stillness in the natural respiratory pause between breaths. That was the window where a shot was born. The crowd grew restless. A few people started to drift away. Caleb let out an exaggerated sigh. "Is he going to shoot or fall asleep?" he muttered. But Reyes knew what Silas was doing. He wasn't just waiting. He was listening. He was feeling. He was becoming one with the complex, chaotic environment. His eyes, narrowed to slits, were reading the story of the wind as it wrote itself across the desert. He was watching the boil of the mirage, which flowed like a river from right to left, indicating the dominant wind direction. He was watching a plastic bag caught on a distant fence post, noting how it would whip violently, then go slack, then whip again. He was feeling the pressure of the air on his own exposed skin. He was building a mental model not just of the wind's speed and direction, but of its very personality, its rhythm, and its habits. Then he saw it. Reyes, watching Silas's head for the slightest movement, saw it too. A subtle shift in the mirage. The distant bag went limp. The pressure on his own face lessened. It was the lull, the 2-second window of relative peace that Silas had spoken of earlier. It was here. In that instant, Silas's body, which had been relaxed, became a statue of granite. He exhaled, letting the air flow out of his lungs until they were empty and still. He settled the rifle's front sight blade into the rear aperture, but he wasn't aiming at the steel plate. Through his binoculars, Reyes could see the rifle was pointed at a patch of empty air, what looked to be a good 10 feet to the left of the target. An insane amount of hold-off, a guess, a prayer. But Reyes knew it wasn't a guess. It was a calculation, performed by a human mind that had been running the same equation for over half a century. It was a solution born not of electronics, but of pure, unadulterated experience. Silas's finger began its final, steady press on the trigger. There was no jerk, no flinch. The movement was so smooth, so deliberate, that it was impossible to tell the exact moment the shot would break. The old Winchester boomed, its deep, throaty report a stark contrast to the sharp, whip-crack sounds of the modern magnums. The rifle pushed back into Silas's shoulder, and he rode the recoil, his eye never leaving the sights, his body absorbing the force as if he were part of the earth itself. He worked the bolt action with fluid grace, ejecting the spent casing and watching it arc through the air. The world seemed to hold its breath. The flight time for a .30-06 bullet at that range was nearly 2 seconds. It was an eternity. The wind, as if angry at being defied, picked up again with a vicious howl. The tiny bullet, a mere 175 grains of lead and copper, was on its own now. A tiny messenger sent on an impossible journey, battling a force of nature that had defeated a dozen men with every technological advantage. Silence. The echo of the shot faded into the vastness of the desert, leaving only the sound of the wind. 1 second. Caleb's smirk was fixed on his face, ready to broaden into a triumphant laugh. 1.5 seconds. Sterling was already shaking his head slightly, a look of pitying sympathy on his face. He had tried to warn the old man. And then it came. Not a loud, satisfying clang, but a faint, high-pitched, metallic ping. The sound was almost lost in the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a copper-jacketed bullet meeting hardened steel at over 1,000 feet per second. It was the sound of the impossible. For a moment, no one reacted. The sound was so improbable that their minds refused to process it. The spotter, a young man who had been calling out misses all day, fumbled with the focus on his high-powered spotting scope. He stared, blinked, and stared again. He keyed his radio, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Hit," he stammered. I have a confirmed hit. Center mass. The plate is, holy cow, the plate is still ringing." The silence was broken by a single, sharp exhalation. It was from Reyes. Then, the small crowd erupted. The scattered applause grew into a wave of shouts and whistles. People were looking at each other, then at the old man on the firing line, their faces masks of stunned admiration. Sterling's jaw was literally hanging open. He looked from the distant target back to Silas, as if he were trying to reconcile two completely incompatible realities. Caleb Vance stood frozen, the smirk wiped clean from his face, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed expression of pure shock. His entire universe, a place carefully constructed of brand names, muzzle velocities, and ballistic data, had just been demolished by a man with a 50-year-old deer rifle and no scope. His technology hadn't just been beaten, it had been rendered irrelevant. Silas, however, showed no emotion at all. No fist pump, no smile of triumph. His movements were as deliberate as before. He caught the spent casing as it fell, its brass still warm, and looked at it for a moment in the palm of his calloused hand. It was a simple, mundane object, but it held the memory of the fire and the journey. He slipped it into his shirt pocket, then calmly began to unwrap the sling from his arm. He had done what he came to do. The applause, the prize, the shock on the faces of the arrogant, none of it seemed to register. He was in his own world, a quiet place of focus and purpose that no one else could enter. He had won the unwinnable bet, and that was all that mattered. As Silas began to carefully wipe down the old Winchester with an oilcloth before placing it back in its canvas case, the world descended upon him. Sterling was the first to arrive, breathless and effusive, waving the oversized novelty check for $15,000 like a battle standard. "Sir, Mr. Silas, that was the most incredible thing I have ever seen in my life. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. You've won the prize." He tried to press the giant check into Silas's hands, but the old man simply held up a palm, stopping him. "I don't want it," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through Sterling's excited babble. The small crowd that had gathered around fell silent. Sterling looked confused, as if Silas had just started speaking a foreign language. "What? Sir, you earned it. $15,000. It's yours." Silas shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't come for the money." He zipped the rifle case closed, his movements precise and final. While Sterling stood there sputtering, Reyes approached, not from the front with the gawking crowd, but from the side. He moved with the quiet respect of one professional approaching another. He didn't offer congratulations or ask how he did it. He knew how. He asked a different question, his voice low so only Silas could hear. "Fubai," Reyes said, "or K-san, sir." It wasn't a question. It was a password, a recognition of a shared, brutal priesthood. Silas stopped what he was doing and turned his head. He looked at Reyes, and for the first time, his pale blue eyes held a deep, knowing warmth. The mask of the quiet farmer fell away, and in its place was the unmistakable look of a warrior recognizing one of his own. "Both," Silas answered, his voice barely a whisper. "And a few other places they never put on the maps. 1st Marine Division. A long, long time ago." Reyes felt a lump form in his throat. He unconsciously straightened his posture, his feet finding their familiar position of parade rest. "Sergeant Reyes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Ramadi, 2006. "The Dark Horse Battalion," Silas said with a nod. "Heard you boys did good work there." In that moment, a bridge was built across 50 years of history, across 2 different wars, across a chasm of experience that no civilian could ever comprehend. They were 2 links in the same chain, forged in the same fire. The crowd, the prize money, the incredible shot, it all faded into the background. All that mattered was the quiet understanding that passed between the old sniper and the young one. Silas finally turned his attention back to the stunned Mr. Sterling. He gestured with his chin towards the far end of the property, where a solitary flagpole stood, the American flag snapping smartly in the relentless wind. At its base was a small, unassuming granite marker that most of the competitors had probably never even noticed. "My grandson," Silas began, his voice now carrying a weight of profound sorrow that hushed the remaining whispers. "Corporal Jacob Thorne, U.S. Army. He was killed 6 years ago today, in the Korangal Valley, Afghanistan. A single shot. He was a sniper too." He paused, swallowing hard. He loved this place. He'd come out here with all his fancy gear, his computers and his big scopes. He'd spend all day trying to hit that plate. Silas patted the canvas case that held the old Winchester. This was his first rifle, the one I taught him on when he was just a boy, back on the farm. Before his last deployment, we were talking. He was teasing me, telling me this old .30-06 couldn't hit the broad side of a barn past 600 yards. I made him a bet. The old man's voice grew thick, and he had to stop to clear his throat. I told him the man matters more than the machine. I bet him I could hit that swinging plate at 1200 with these old iron sights. He laughed and said if I ever did it, he'd finally believe that the old ways still had some magic in them. Silas looked out at the distant plate, now shrouded in the twilight gloom. I just came to win a bet, he said softly. I owed him that. A wave of silent, powerful emotion washed over the small crowd. The incredible feat of marksmanship was suddenly recontextualized. It wasn't about a prize or about showing up the hot shots. It was a memorial. It was a promise kept. It was a grandfather's final, heartbreaking tribute to the boy he had raised and the warrior he had become. Caleb Vance was standing at the edge of the circle, close enough to hear every word. The color had drained from his face. The arrogance and condescension he had displayed all day had curdled into a deep and profound shame. He looked at his own rifle, a sterile, technological marvel of carbon fiber and aluminum, and it suddenly felt like a hollow, meaningless toy. He had treated the craft as a game, a way to win prizes and gain followers on social media. This old man had just shown him its soul. Silas turned to Sterling, his expression gentle but resolute. Give the money to one of those charities for wounded soldiers, he said. The one Jacob always donated to. They'll know what to do with it. And with that, he picked up his rifle case and his small canvas bag and turned to leave. He didn't wait for thanks or further questions. His work there was done. Reyes fell into step beside Silas, walking with him toward the dusty parking lot where a faded blue Ford pickup truck waited, a vehicle as old and reliable as its owner. They walked in a comfortable silence for a moment. The only sound, the crunch of their boots on the gravel, and the ever-present sigh of the wind. That was some fine shooting, sir, Reyes finally said, unable to hold it in any longer. Not just the shot, the whole process, the wind read, the patience. It was a masterclass. Silas offered a small, sad smile. You practice something long enough, it becomes part of you, like breathing. After a while, you stop thinking about it. You just do it. The wind tells you a story, and you just have to be quiet enough to hear it. They reached the old truck. Silas carefully placed the cased rifle on the passenger seat, treating it with the reverence one would afford a holy relic. He was a good boy, Silas said, his voice distant, his gaze fixed on the horizon. A better man than I ever was. He saw the world in black and white, right and wrong. I saw too much gray. Reyes understood the weight of those words, the burden of a long life lived in the shadows of conflict. You honored him today, sir, Reyes said quietly, in a way nobody else could have. Silas turned and looked at Reyes, his pale eyes searching the younger man's face. You make sure you take care of yourself, Sergeant, he said, placing a heavy, calloused hand on Reyes's shoulder. This world, it's loud. It's easy to forget how to be quiet. Don't forget. He climbed into the truck, the door groaning on its hinges. The engine turned over with a familiar rumbling cough, and with a final nod to Reyes, Silas drove away, his taillights disappearing down the long dirt road, leaving nothing behind but a legend and a profound sense of awe. Reyes stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle. He felt as though he had just encountered something sacred, a living embodiment of the creed he had dedicated his life to. He felt humbled and inspired all at once. He turned to walk back toward the range and saw a solitary figure standing by the small granite memorial at the base of the flagpole. It was Caleb Vance. His expensive rifle was leaning against a post, forgotten. He was standing perfectly still, his head bowed, reading the inscription on the stone. Corporal Jacob Thorne, beloved son, soldier, hero. For those I love, I will sacrifice. Caleb stood there for what seemed like an hour as the last of the light bled from the sky and the stars began to appear in the vast desert heavens. When he finally turned away, his face was changed. The arrogance was gone, washed away by a tide of humility. The smug certainty had been replaced by a quiet, questioning reverence. He looked at his high-tech rifle, then back at the empty firing line, and finally up at the flag, still fighting the wind. He had come to the Viper Strike Challenge to win a prize, to prove his skill, and to feed his ego. He was leaving with something far more valuable, a lesson in the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of a warrior's heart. He finally understood that the most important target isn't always the one downrange.